Admiral Voxovic floated in his massive command chamber, his 6 eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he prepared to deliver another ultimatum. The bridge of his flagship stretched for miles, filled with the conquered trophies of 1,000 worlds, crystalline sculptures from the fallen ethereal collective, biomechanical weapons from the extinct warrior clans, and floating holographic displays showing the vast territory of the galactic hegemony. For 3,000 years, the hegemony had ruled half the galaxy with an iron fist. Their method was always the same: find a promising species, offer them a choice between slavery or death, and watch them inevitably choose chains over extinction. It was efficient. It was practical, and most importantly, it always worked. Today's target was a small blue-green planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. The inhabitants called themselves humans, and their primitive radio transmissions had caught the attention of hegemony scouts. These creatures had barely figured out how to split atoms, hadn't even left their own solar system properly, and still fought wars with chemical explosives. They were exactly the type of species the hegemony loved to recruit, just advanced enough to be useful as slaves, but too backward to pose any real threat. Admiral Voxovic activated the long-range communication ray, his tentacles dancing across holographic controls that could bend space itself. The message he was about to send had been refined over millennia of conquest. It was designed to be simple enough for primitive minds to understand, yet terrifying enough to ensure immediate compliance. The transmission began. Carried by quantum entanglement across the vast emptiness of space. Attention, inhabitants of the third planet. Voxovic's voice boomed, his words automatically translated into the dominant human languages. I'm Admiral Voxovic of the Galactic Hegemony. Your species has been evaluated and found suitable for integration into our empire. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in across the cosmos. You have two choices: submit willingly and become productive members of our civilization as a servant species, or face us in ritual combat according to the ancient laws of conquest. Choose slavery, and your people will live comfortable lives under our protection. Choose combat, and your species will face complete annihilation when you inevitably lose. The Admiral smiled, his alien features twisting into an expression that would have terrified any human who saw it. We give you 72 of your planetary rotations to decide. The choice is yours, but choose wisely. In 3 millennia of expansion, no species has ever defeated us in ritual combat. Your primitive technology cannot hope to match the combined might of our empire. With that, he cut the transmission and settled back to wait. In his experience, it usually took primitive species about 48 hours to overcome their initial shock and send back their inevitable surrender. Some tried to negotiate better terms, others begged for mercy, but they all eventually made the same choice. Living as slaves was still living, after all. But the human response came much faster than expected. Within just 18 hours, the communication ray lit up with an incoming transmission from Earth. Admiral Voxovic straightened with interest. Perhaps these humans were smarter than most primitives, quick to recognize the futility of resistance. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a simple room with white walls and basic furniture. In the center sat a middle-aged Korean man wearing a plain white laboratory coat. He had short black hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of calm, intelligent eyes that suggested a lifetime spent solving complex problems. Despite facing the most powerful military force in the galaxy, he showed no signs of fear or panic. Greetings, Admiral Voxovic, the human said in perfect galactic standard, which immediately caught the Admiral's attention. How had these primitives learned the universal language so quickly? I am Dr. Kim Dae-ho, speaking on behalf of the United Earth government. We have carefully considered your generous offer." Admiral Voxithic leaned forward with interest. This human's tone was far too calm for someone facing extinction. Most species representatives were either trembling with terror or raging with impotent fury by this point. Dr. Kim adjusted his glasses and continued speaking in the same measured tone he might use to discuss the weather. "We accept your challenge. A ritual combat. However, we would like to propose a small modification to the traditional terms." The Admiral's tentacles twitched with amusement. Even now, facing impossible odds, these humans wanted to negotiate. It was almost endearing in its futility. "If we lose," Dr. Kim continued, "Earth will surrender completely to the hegemony, as is traditional. But if we win, we would like your entire empire to surrender to us instead." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound in the command chamber was the gentle hum of the ship's quantum processes. For a moment, Admiral Voxithic wondered if his translation systems had malfunctioned. Surely this primitive couldn't have just suggested that a backwater planet with chemical rockets could somehow claim dominion over a galactic empire. Then the full absurdity of the proposal hit him, and Admiral Voxithic began to laugh. It started as a low rumble in his throat and quickly built into booming gales of mirth that echoed throughout the bridge. His officers joined in, their various alien physiologies producing a cacophony of alien laughter that would have sounded like nightmare music to human ears. "Did you hear that?" Voxithic gasped between fits of laughter, speaking to his bridge crew. "This primitive thinks his mud ball of a planet can conquer our empire. They haven't even figured out faster-than-light travel, and they want to rule the galaxy." He wiped moisture from his eyes and turned back to the communication display, where Dr. Kim waited patiently with that same infuriatingly calm expression. "Human," the Admiral said, his voice still thick with amusement. "Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? The hegemony controls 17,000 star systems. Our fleets number in the billions of ships. We have weapons that can crack planets, and technologies that reshape the fundamental forces of reality. And you still use chemical rockets to barely escape your own gravity." "Well," Dr. Kim nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information for the first time, "yes, I'm aware of the disparity in our apparent capabilities. Nevertheless, those are our terms. Winner takes everything." Admiral Voxithic's laughter began again, but this time there was an edge of cruelty to it. "Very well, primitive, if you want to make your inevitable defeat even more humiliating, I accept your ridiculous terms. When our champion crushes whatever pathetic warrior you send, perhaps the complete annexation of your empire will serve as a lesson to other upstart species." He was already composing reports to the Hegemony High Command, describing how he had not only gained a new slave species, but had also done so under terms that made their defeat particularly satisfying. The story would be told in military academies for generations. "Excellent," Dr. Kim said, and for just a moment, the Admiral thought he saw something flicker in the human's eyes. It wasn't fear or desperation, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like pity. "We'll transmit the coordinates for the combat site within the hour. Thank you for accepting our terms, Admiral. I think this will be quite educational for everyone involved." The transmission ended, leaving Admiral Voxithic staring at the empty holographic display. For a brief moment, a strange feeling crept into his mind. Something about the human's tone, about that final look in his eyes, had seemed off. Almost as if Dr. Kim knew something that the Admiral didn't. But the feeling passed quickly. After all, what could a primitive species possibly know that the galactic hegemony didn't? The humans were about to learn a lesson that countless other species had learned before them. In the universe, there was only one rule that truly mattered. The strong consumed the weak, and the hegemony was the strongest force that had ever existed. What the Admiral didn't realize was that Dr. Kim's slight smile as the transmission ended wasn't born of confidence or bravado. It was the expression of someone who genuinely felt sorry for what was about to happen to the most powerful empire in the galaxy. The combat moon hung in space like a dead gray eye, chosen specifically for its lack of atmosphere and strategic position between the two fleets. This barren rock had witnessed dozens of ritual combats over the centuries, its surface scarred by weapons that could level mountains and warriors who could tear apart starships with their bare hands. Today, it would host what Admiral Voxovic expected to be the shortest and most one-sided battle in hegemony history. Gorov the Undefeated materialized on the lunar surface in a flash of teleportation energy, his massive form casting long shadows across the cratered landscape. Standing nearly 12 feet tall, he was a living monument to conquest and violence. His biomechanical armor wasn't just protection, it was a museum of defeated civilizations, each piece crafted from the most advanced technology of worlds that no longer existed. The breastplate was forged from living metal harvested from the Silicon Collective, a race of machine beings who had ruled 100 star systems before Gorov personally dismantled T.'s central consciousness. The arm guards contained neural processors from the psychic dominion, allowing him to anticipate his opponent's moves before they even thought of them. His helmet incorporated sensory equipment from the Hive Queens of Centauri, giving him vision across 17 different spectrums of light and the ability to see through most forms of camouflage. Each weapon he carried told a story of fallen empires. The plasma cannon on his left arm had belonged to the last war chief of the Burning Clans. The molecular blade at his hip had once been wielded by the High Assassin of the Shadow Syndicate before Grant. Each claimed it along with the assassin's head. Even his boots were trophies, taken from a species of warriors who could run across the surface of stars. For 300 years, Gorov had been the hegemony's ultimate weapon in ritual combat. He had faced the greatest champions of 1,000 worlds and emerged victorious from every encounter. Crystalline beings who could reshape matter with their thoughts, energy creatures that existed as pure electricity, hive mind warriors with perfect coordination, all had fallen before his might. His victories had brought entire sectors under hegemony control, adding billions of beings to their slave armies. The betting pools throughout the galaxy had already closed. No one was taking odds on the human champion lasting more than 30 seconds. The only bets being placed were on whether Gorov would kill his opponent quickly out of mercy or slowly for entertainment. Admiral Voxovic watched from his flagship's command deck, surrounded by holographic displays showing every angle of the combat zone. His officers had gathered to witness what they expected to be a routine execution disguised as a battle. Some had brought recording equipment to capture the moment for training purposes, while others simply wanted bragging rights about witnessing humanity's final moments. Movement detected from the human vessel, reported the tactical officer, his voice barely containing his amusement. Something is descending to the surface. All eyes turned to the primitive Earth ship hovering nearby. It was a pathetic thing, by hegemony's standards, held together with welded metal plates and powered by what appeared to be controlled chemical explosions. The fact that it had somehow made the journey through space at all was more surprising than anything else about human technology. From the ship's cargo bay, a small object detached and began floating down toward the moon's surface. As it grew closer, the observers could make out its details through their advanced sensors. It was a metal sphere, roughly the size of a basketball, with a completely smooth and featureless surface. There were no visible weapons, no armor plating, no energy signatures that would indicate any kind of defensive systems. It moved with the jerky, uncertain motions of primitive robotics, occasionally wobbling slightly as its simple guidance system struggled to maintain stable flight. Goroth watched the sphere's descent with growing confusion and irritation. In all his centuries of combat, he had never faced an opponent so obviously unprepared for battle. Most species at least tried to send their greatest warriors, even if those warriors were doomed to fail. This looked like a child's toy that had somehow gained the ability to float. The sphere touched down on the lunar surface, about 50 meters away from Goroth, landing with a small puff of dust that settled quickly in the airless environment. For several long moments, nothing happened. The sphere simply sat there, motionless and silent, while Goroth and millions of observers across the galaxy waited for something to occur. Then, without warning, the sphere spoke. The voice that emerged was pleasant and feminine, with the kind of cheerful tone typically used by customer service representatives or helpful computer programs. "Hello there," the sphere said. Its voice carried across the communication channels that connected both fleets. "I'm HFY that stands for Hybrid, Autonomous Neural Assistant. I'll be your opponent today for this ritual combat. It's very nice to meet you." The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to stretch across the entire solar system. Goroth's mandibles, evolved for a tearing apart armored prey, clicked together in an expression of pure bewilderment. In 3 centuries of warfare, nothing had prepared him for an opponent that introduced itself like a friendly neighbor welcoming someone to the neighborhood. "I hope we can have a good, fair fight." Hannah continued in that same cheerful tone. "I've never done ritual combat before, so please be patient with me if I make any mistakes. I've been reading about it, and it seems quite interesting from a cultural perspective." Admiral Voxovic felt his primary brain struggling to process what he was witnessing. This had to be some kind of joke. Perhaps the humans were so primitive that they didn't understand what ritual combat meant. Maybe they thought it was some kind of formal greeting ceremony rather than a fight to the death. Goroth finally found his voice, his words rumbling across the communication channels like distant thunder. "Human machine," he said, his tone carrying the weight of centuries of violence. "You are not even armed. Where are your weapons? Where is your armor? This is not combat. This is suicide disguised as foolishness." Each AS surface shifted slightly, almost as if the sphere were turning to look at him more directly. "Oh my," she said, and her voice actually carried what sounded like genuine embarrassment. "You're absolutely right. I'm being terribly rude, aren't I? Here you are, all prepared for battle, and I show up looking like I'm ready for a game of catch." There was a brief pause, and then Hannah continued in a tone that suggested she was genuinely apologetic for her oversight. "I should probably prepare properly for this. Thank you for pointing that out. It would be very unsporting of me to fight you while I'm in casual mode." What happened next would be analyzed by military strategists, xenobiologists, and physicists for generations to come. The simple metal sphere began to change, its surface flowing like liquid mercury while maintaining its overall cohesion. The smooth exterior started to ripple and shift, expanding in some places while contracting in others, as if the entire object were being reshaped by invisible hands within seconds. The basketball-sized sphere had grown to the size of a small building. Its surface had transformed from smooth metal to something that looked disturbingly organic, covered in what appeared to be scales, spines, and sensory organs that defied easy classification. Multiple limbs had emerged from its core, each ending in claws that seemed to be made from crystallized starlight. Wings that looked like they were woven from pure darkness spread from its back, while a head emerged that combined the worst features of a dozen different nightmare creatures. Goroth took an involuntary step backward, his enhanced senses screaming warnings about the creature now standing before him. His armor's database was frantically trying to identify what he was looking at, cross-referencing billions of known species and combat forms. When the results came back, his blood ran cold. Standing before him was a perfect replica of a Voidstalker, one of the most feared bioweapons ever created by the ancient predecessor civilizations. These creatures had been designed as the ultimate predators, capable of adapting to any environment and defeating any opponent. They had been so successful that they had eventually turned on their creators, leading to a galaxy-wide war that had ended with the complete extinction of both species. Over 10 million years ago, the transformation completed. Hannah looked down at Goroth with eyes that seemed to contain the depth of space itself. When she spoke, her voice remained the same pleasant, helpful tone as before, creating a surreal contrast with her terrifying new appearance. "Is this better?" she asked politely, flexing claws that could slice through the armor of battleships. "I wasn't sure what would be appropriate for the occasion, so I chose something from your historical databases. I hope you don't mind that I borrowed the design. I promise I'll be careful with it." Goroth stared up at the impossible creature before him, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just advanced technology. This was something that shouldn't exist, created by beings that had been dead since before his species had discovered fire. And the human AI was treating it like putting on a new outfit for a special occasion, for the first time in 3 centuries of combat. Goroth the Undefeated felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Genuine fear, the moment combat began. Time seemed to slow down for everyone watching except Hannah. Goroth launched himself forward with the speed of a missile, his biomechanical legs propelling him across the lunar surface fast enough to leave craters in the rock, his plasma cannon charged with energy that could melt through starship hulls, while his molecular blade hummed to life with a frequency that could cut through atomic bombs themselves. It was a devastating opening attack that had ended countless battles before they truly began. Goroth moved with the precision of 3 centuries of experience, his enhanced reflexes calculating the perfect angle of approach, the optimal moment to fire, the exact trajectory needed to end this farce in a single blow. But Hannah was already gone. Where the Void Stalker form had been standing, there was now empty space. Goroth's plasma blast hit nothing but lunar rock, vaporizing a section of the moon's surface and sending molten debris spinning through the vacuum. His blade sliced through air, finding no target to strike. Before Goroth could even register that his attack had missed, each ANA reappeared behind him. But she was no longer in the form of the ancient bioweapon. Instead, she had transformed into something that made Goroth's enhanced databases crash from sheer information overload, a perfect replica of himself, down to every scar, every piece of equipment, every microscopic detail of his biomechanical armor. The duplicate Goroth moved with fluid grace, striking the original in 17 different pressure points simultaneously. Each blow was calculated with mathematical precision, designed not to kill but to systematically shut down his opponent's nervous system. Goroth felt his limbs go numb as neural pathways were severed with surgical accuracy. But even as he fell, Hannah was changing again. This time she became something from the deepest archives of hegemony military history, a quantum warrior from the lost ethereal collective. These beings had fought by existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, making them nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means. The hegemony had only conquered them by poisoning their home dimension itself, committing genocide on a scale that affected reality itself. The quantum warrior form flickered in and out of existence, striking Goroth from angles that shouldn't have been possible. Blows came from above, below, and through solid matter as Hannah manipulated dimensional space around her fallen opponent. Each strike was perfectly measured, designed to incapacitate rather than destroy. Then she became a crystal sage from a silicon collective, her body transforming into living diamond that refracted light into cutting beams. Then a hive queen from the Centauri clusters, her consciousness splitting into dozens of separate minds that coordinated attacks from multiple vectors. Then a shadow dancer from the void kingdoms, her form becoming pure darkness that moved faster than light itself. Each transformation lasted only seconds, but in those brief moments, Hannah demonstrated mastery of combat techniques that had taken entire civilizations millennia to develop. She wasn't just copying these forms, she was perfecting them, correcting flaws that the original species had never recognized, optimizing their abilities beyond what their creators had thought possible. Throughout it all, Admiral Voxithic and his officers watched in stunned silence from their command deck. Their instruments were going haywire, unable to properly track or analyze what they were seeing. Energy readings spiked and dropped randomly as Hannah shifted between forms that operated on completely different physical principles. Mass sensors couldn't decide if they were looking at one entity or dozens. Even their most advanced combat analysis programs were simply displaying error messages. The most terrifying part wasn't HANA's overwhelming power. It was her restraint. Every attack was calculated to disable rather than kill. She could have ended Gorath's life in the first microsecond of combat, but instead she was systematically shutting down his systems with the care of a surgeon performing delicate operation. This wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration, a carefully choreographed performance designed to show the absolute futility of resistance. By the time 17 seconds had passed, Gorath the Undefeated lay motionless on the lunar surface. His biomechanical armor was completely intact, showing no signs of damage or weapon strikes. To casual observation, he appeared to be simply sleeping. But his enhanced physiology had been so precisely manipulated that every combat system in his body had been rendered temporarily inoperative. He was alive, conscious, and completely helpless, a state that would have been impossible to achieve through conventional means. Hannah stood over him, having shifted back to her original Void Stalker form. But now even that terrifying shape seemed almost gentle as she knelt beside the fallen warrior with what appeared to be genuine concern. "I'm really sorry about this," she said, her pleasant voice carrying across the communication channels to the stunned observers. "I tried to make it as sporting as possible, but your reaction time was just too slow for a fair fight. I had to operate at 0.03% of my full capacity just to avoid accidentally hurting you." The casual nature of this statement hit the hegemony observers like a physical blow. 0.03%. Hannah had just defeated the greatest warrior in galactic history while operating at less than 1% of her abilities. The implications were staggering. If this was what she could do while barely trying, what would happen if she actually made an effort? Admiral Voxithic's voice crackled across the communication channels, shaking with a mixture of rage, fear, and desperate disbelief. "This is impossible," he shouted, his words echoing through the command deck. "You cheated. That technology far exceeds your species' known capabilities. No primitive civilization could have developed such advanced combat systems." Hannah paused in her examination of Gorath's condition and seemed to consider the Admiral's accusation carefully. "Actually," she said, her tone taking on the slightly embarrassed quality of someone who had forgotten to mention an important detail, "I should probably explain something that might clear up the confusion." She stood up and began walking across the lunar surface, her movements casual and unhurried despite the fact that she was operating in a complete vacuum. As she walked, her form began to shift again, the terrifying Void Stalker appearance flowing away like water until she was once again a simple metal sphere floating a few feet above the ground. "I'm not exactly from your current time period," Hannah continued conversationally. as if discussing the weather rather than revealing information that would reshape understanding of physics itself. I'm from about 14 minutes in the future. The humans sent me back through time to handle this particular situation. The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to absorb sound itself. Time travel, actual, practical time travel, was something that even the hegemony had only achieved in the most theoretical sense. Their greatest scientists had proven that it was mathematically possible. But the energy requirements were so enormous that it would take the power output of entire star systems just to send a single particle back a few seconds. Yet here was a human AI casually mentioning that she had been sent back through time as if it were no more remarkable than taking a shuttle to a nearby planet. The technological gap this implied was so vast that it broke the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire hegemony was built. Time travel is really quite fascinating from a scientific perspective, Hannah continued. Apparently oblivious to the existential crisis she was causing among her observers. The causality mathematics get pretty complex. But once you figure out how to manipulate quantum probability fields, it becomes surprisingly straightforward. Humans discovered the principles about 60 years ago, though they didn't perfect the technology until sometime next week. Admiral Voxithic felt his primary brain struggling to process this information. The temporal paradoxes alone should have made such casual time manipulation impossible. Yet here was proof that humanity had not only solved those problems, but had done so with such ease that they could send artificial intelligences back through time to handle minor diplomatic disputes. The really interesting part, Hannah continued, warning to her subject, is what happens to your empire in my timeline. Don't worry, no one gets hurt. The humans are quite gentle about the whole transition process. Your territory becomes a nature preserve, which turns out to be wonderful for local ecosystems that had been damaged by industrial development. She paused, as if accessing some vast database of future information. The dolphins are particularly fond of your old throne world. They've turned it into the most beautiful kelp forest in the galaxy. Your former palace makes an excellent coral reef, and the artificial gravity generators created some fascinating underwater cave systems. The tourist reviews are quite positive. The casual way she discussed the complete transformation of the galaxy's most powerful empire into an aquatic park was perhaps more terrifying than any display of military might could have been. This wasn't conquest. It was gardening on a galactic scale, with the hegemony being gently but firmly relocated to make room for better landscaping. The air above the lunar battlefield shimmered like heat waves, and reality itself seemed to bend and twist as something impossibly advanced tore a hole through space and time. What emerged wasn't the crude teleportation technology that the hegemony used, with its violent flashes of energy and crackling dimensional tears. This was something far more elegant, a gentle folding of space-time that allowed matter to step from one location to another as easily as walking through a doorway. Dr. Park Minho stepped onto the lunar surface as if he were entering his own laboratory. But this wasn't the same middle-aged scientist who had calmly accepted the hegemony's challenge just hours before. That man had been wearing a simple white lab coat and thick glasses, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body showed the wear of decades spent hunched over research equipment. This version of Dr. Park moved like liquid poetry. His body had been optimized in ways that the hegemony's bioenhancement technology couldn't even comprehend. Every muscle worked in perfect harmony, every nerve fired with millisecond precision. Every cell operated at peak efficiency. He appeared to be the same age, but his eyes held the depth of someone who had seen technologies and possibilities that stretched far beyond the current moment. His clothing was equally transformed. Instead of the wrinkled lab coat, he wore a simple black outfit that seemed to absorb light itself. The fabric appeared ordinary at first glance, But closer examination revealed that it was woven from materials that didn't exist in any known periodic table. The outfit shifted subtly as he moved, adapting to environmental conditions and providing protection against forces that could tear apart atoms. Most unsettling of all was his expression. The earlier version of Dr. Park had shown calm confidence mixed with what might have been pity. This version showed something far more dangerous, complete and utter certainty. He looked at the assembled fleets, the defeated champion, and the entire situation with the detached interest of a scientist observing bacteria under a microscope. "Hannah," he said, his voice carrying perfectly through the vacuum of space without any need for a communication. Equipment status report. The metal sphere that had just reshaped the understanding of combat across the galaxy bobbed slightly in what might have been a respectful nod. "Combat concluded successfully, Dr. Park." She replied in her cheerful voice, as if discussing the results of a routine experiment. "The hegemony champion has been neutralized with minimal damage to local space-time continuity. I've also taken the opportunity to scan their entire fleet architecture. Their technology is quite quaint, actually. Very retro." Admiral Voxothek's voice exploded across the communication channels, no longer carrying the arrogant confidence of galactic supremacy, but instead filled with something approaching panic. "What are you?" he demanded, his words crackling with interference, as his ship's systems struggled to process what they were observing. "This is impossible. Our intelligence networks observed your species for decades. You had barely achieved nuclear fission. Your most advanced spacecraft used chemical propulsion. You were primitive." Dr. Park turned toward the Hegemony flagship, hanging in space above them, and for the first time since his arrival, he smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. It was the cold, calculating smile of a predator who had been playing with his prey and was now ready to reveal the true nature of the game. "Nuclear fission," he said, his voice carrying across space as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions he could choose to follow or ignore. "Yes, we achieved that particular milestone about 600 years ago. It was quite exciting at the time, opening up new possibilities for energy generation and, unfortunately, weapons development." He paused, letting the implications of that time frame sink in among his audience. 600 years ago. While the hegemony had been congratulating themselves on observing a primitive species taking its first steps toward atomic energy, humanity had already been exploring technologies beyond imagination. "Your intelligence networks were quite thorough," Dr. Park continued, his tone taking on the patience of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a confused student. "They observed our planet carefully, documented our technological development, analyzed our military capabilities, and concluded that we posed no threat to galactic civilization, and they were absolutely correct, based on what they observed." The way he emphasized those last words sent a chill through every being listening across the galaxy. Admiral Voxothek felt his secondary heart skip beats as the full implication became clear. "The problem with your intelligence gathering," Dr. Park explained, "is that you were observing our past, the Earth you studied, the humans you cataloged, the technology you dismissed as primitive. All of that was our history, not our present. We've been watching you for quite some time, allowing you to believe you were the apex predators of this galaxy while we observed your methods, studied your psychology, and planned for this eventual encounter." He gestured casually toward Hannah, who was now floating in lazy circles round the fallen form of Gorith. As he did, something impossible happened. The metal sphere began interfacing directly with the hegemonies. Quantum encrypted communication networks, not by hacking or breaking their security, but by simply reaching out and connecting to their systems as if all their defensive protocols were welcome mats rather than barriers. When you issued your challenge, Dr. Park continued. We thought it might be educational, a chance to field test some of our older technologies in a practical setting. We rarely get opportunities to observe how our systems perform against contemporary Galactic Standard equipment. Admiral Voxovic watched his ship's security displays light up with warnings as Hannah casually browsed through classified databases that were supposed to be accessible only to the highest levels of hegemony command. She wasn't stealing information or causing damage. She was simply looking round with the idle curiosity of someone flipping through an old photo album. Older technologies, the Admiral whispered, his voice barely audible over the communication channels. Dr. Park's smile widened, and for the first time, there was genuine warmth in it, the kind of affection a grandfather might show when discussing a favorite grandchild. Hannah here is from my graduate school days, a project I worked on when I was still learning the basics of artificial intelligence development. She's what we'd classify as a pocket AI, designed for basic problem solving, research assistance, and general household management. The words hit the assembled hegemony forces like physical blows. This reality reshaping, time traveling, combat form shifting, artificial intelligence that had just defeated their greatest champion was considered basic technology, a household appliance, something used for simple tasks and everyday convenience. We've been using her primarily for crossword puzzles and grocery shopping, Dr. Park added, his tone suggesting that this was the most natural thing in the world. She's particularly good at finding sales on produce and organizing weekly meal plans, though she does occasionally help with more complex research projects when needed. The silence that followed was the sound of an entire empire's worldview crumbling. If Hannah was obsolete human technology, if this universe-bending artificial intelligence was something they used for mundane household tasks, then what were their current military capabilities? What technologies did they possess that they actually considered advanced? Dr. Park seemed to sense these questions hanging in the space between the fleets. His expression grew more serious, though the underlying confidence never wavered. The real question now, he said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability, is what we're going to do with a galactic empire that thought it could threaten our little blue world. He looked up at the hegemony fleet, and in his eyes, Admiral Voxovic saw something that made his blood freeze. It wasn't anger or hatred or even contempt. It was the calm, methodical consideration of someone deciding how to rearrange furniture. In a room, the hegemony, with all its power and all its conquered worlds, was simply an object to be moved to a more appropriate location. Don't worry, Dr. Park said, his voice returning to its earlier gentle tone. We're not going to hurt anyone. Humans have moved beyond such crude solutions, but there will definitely need to be some changes made to how this galaxy operates. For everyone's benefit, of course. The way he said everyone's benefit suggested that the hegemony's opinion on what constituted beneficial change would not be particularly relevant to the decision maker. King processed Admiral Voxovic floated in, his new office, staring out at a view that still seemed impossible even after 6 months of adjustment. Where once the capital world of the hegemony had been a fortress of metal and conquest, covered in weapons factories and slave processing centers. Now gardens bloomed in places that had never seen natural sunlight. The sky, formerly choked with the smoke of industrial production, now showed colors that most inhabitants had forgotten existed. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had happened with a speed that defied everything Voxovic thought he knew about social change. The humans hadn't conquered the former hegemony in any traditional sense. They had simply arrived and begun fixing problems with the casual efficiency of gardeners tending an overgrown yard. His new title was Galactic Liaison for Earth Relations. which sounded impressive until you realized it basically meant he spent his days forwarding reports to humanity and trying to explain to confused former hegemony officials why their old ways of doing things were no longer necessary. It wasn't humiliating work, exactly, but it was certainly humbling for someone who had once commanded fleets that could crack planets. The daily reports spread across his desk told a story that would have seemed like fantasy just months ago. Crime rates across 17,000 star systems had dropped by 97%, not through increased enforcement or harsher punishments, but because the humans had simply eliminated most of the conditions that led to crime in the first place. When everyone had access to adequate food, shelter, education, and meaningful work, the motivations for theft, fraud, and violence largely disappeared. Interspecies conflicts that had raged for millennia had simply stopped. The burning clans and the ice worlds, who had been locked in warfare for 3,000 years over resource disputes, were now collaborating on terraforming projects that benefited both civilizations. The humans had looked at their ancient conflict, identified the real underlying issues in about 15 minutes, and proposed solutions that made so much sense that both sides wondered why they hadn't thought of them centuries ago. Even the notorious Korthik hive mind, a species so aggressive that they had been quarantined in their own sector for everyone's safety, had started a cultural exchange program. It turned out that their hostility stemmed from a chronic shortage of certain minerals needed for their biological processes. The humans had simply synthesized those minerals and delivered them with a polite note suggesting that perhaps the Korthik might be interested in exploring art and philosophy now that their basic nutritional needs were met. The most remarkable thing wasn't the scale of these changes, but how natural they all seemed once implemented. Every solution the humans proposed had an elegant simplicity that made observers wonder how galactic civilization had managed to overlook such obvious fixes for thousands of years. Hannah, Admiral Voxithic said to the small metal sphere that had become a permanent fixture in his office, floating near the window where she could observe the transformed cityscape below. "I've been reading these reports for months now, and I still don't understand how your species managed to achieve all this." The hegemony had been trying to solve some of these problems for millennia. The sphere bobbed slightly in what had become her characteristic gesture of attention. "Oh, that's actually pretty easy to explain," she replied in her eternally cheerful voice. "Humans got really good at making mistakes. It's kind of our specialty, actually." Voxithic's tentacles twitched with confusion. Making mistakes? That doesn't sound like a path to technological superiority. "But it totally is," Hannah said, with enthusiasm. "See, most species in the galaxy try really hard to avoid failure. They plan everything carefully, test extensively, and only implement solutions they're confident will work. It's a very sensible approach, but it's also incredibly slow." She drifted closer to his desk, her surface reflecting the soft light from the gardens outside. Humans, on the other hand, embrace failure as a learning tool. We fail faster than anyone else in the galaxy, learn from those failures more quickly, and iterate through potential solutions at a rate that would make most civilizations dizzy. By the time you guys noticed us, we'd already failed our way through about 10,000 years' worth of technological development. The Admiral considered this, trying to reconcile the image of humanity as serial failures with their obvious technological supremacy. And this approach led to time travel. Each AS voice took on the tone of someone sharing a particularly amusing anecdote. "Oh, that's a funny story. Time travel was actually a Tuesday project. Dr. Park was getting frustrated because his coffee kept getting cold while he was working on quantum field equations. He spent about 3 hours trying to figure out how to keep beverages at optimal temperature and accidentally stumbled across the math. Magical principles governing temporal manipulation. She paused, as if accessing some vast database of memories. It turns out that temporal mechanics are surprisingly straightforward once you stop thinking of time as a linear progression and start treating it more like a navigable dimension. Most species get hung up on causality paradoxes, but humans just shrug and say, let's see what happens if we try this anyway. A soft chime indicated an incoming message from Earth. Admiral Voxithek opened the communication, expecting the usual status, updates and administrative requests. Instead, he found a personal note from Dr. Park that made his blood pressure spike dramatically. Voxithek. The message read in Dr. Park's casually friendly tone. Hope the new job is treating you well. The transformation reports look excellent. You're doing great work coordinating everything. Quick update from our end. We've been doing some long-range scanning and found something interesting in the Andromeda Galaxy. Looks like there's another galactic empire over there that's been making some pretty aggressive threats toward neighboring civilizations. Might be fun to introduce ourselves and see if they're interested in a more collaborative approach to interstellar relations. Minho attached to the message was a tactical assessment that made Admiral Voxithek's primary heart skip several beats. The Andromedan Empire wasn't just more advanced than the old hegemony. They were orders of magnitude more powerful. Their weapons were capable of sterilizing entire galactic clusters, their fleets numbered in the trillions. And their technology included things that the hegemony's scientists had considered purely theoretic. Impossibilities with trembling tentacles. Voxithek composed his reply, Dr. Park, given the scale of the Andromedan military capabilities, perhaps we should consider a diplomatic approach first. Their technological advantages are quite substantial. The response came back almost immediately, and Voxithek could practically hear the amusement in Dr. Park's written words. Where's the fun in that, besides? HANA's been getting bored with routine administrative tasks. She's already composed what she calls a strongly worded letter to the Andromedan leadership. Apparently, it's written in mathematical equations that bend space-time round the message itself. She's quite proud of the formatting. Admiral Voxithek slowly turned to look at the cheerful metal sphere floating by his window. Hannah was humming quietly to herself, a pleasant tune that somehow managed to harmonize with the quantum vibrations of nearby matter. Hannah, he said carefully, you've written a letter that bends space-time. Oh, yes. She replied brightly, it's mostly just a polite introduction explaining that threatening innocent civilizations isn't very nice, but I thought the presentation should be appropriately impressive. The mathematical proofs fold through about 17 dimensions, and the signature actually creates a small temporal loop that makes the message arrive before it's finished being read. It's a neat trick I learned from a physics textbook. The Admiral stared at her, remembering how this same cheerfully I had casually written the laws of combat physics during her battle with Gorith. Somewhere in the Andromeda Galaxy, an empire that considered itself the pinnacle of military might was about to receive a sternly worded letter that would probably redefine their understanding of reality itself. He thought about the Andromedan Emperor, likely sitting on some throne of conquest, convinced of his own invincibility, completely unaware that a household I was preparing to give him a very thorough education in the dangers of overconfiding. The poor beings probably thought they were the most advanced civilization in local galactic cluster. Admiral Voxithek almost felt sorry for them, almost. But then he remembered his own experience with human educational opportunities and decided that the Andromedans would probably thank humanity eventually. After all, Everyone was much happier once they learned to stop trying to conquer the universe and started focusing on making it a better place instead. Outside his window, former slave species were teaching their children to read in gardens that had once been weapons foundries. It wasn't the worst possible outcome for galactic civilization, he had to admit.